They surrounded her, naked bodies forming a hostile circle in the steamy showers, jeers and threats filling the air. "Get out," they demanded, unaware of who she truly was, the SEAL commander they'd soon answer to. The revelation would shatter their world and change the dynamics of the elite unit forever. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Steam curled through the tiled showers of the Norfolk Naval Base, dancing in the harsh fluorescent light. At 0200 hours, the corridor stood silent, most personnel long since retired to their quarters. Commander Sarah Johnson rolled her shoulders under the hot spray, washing away the remnants of a grueling training session. At 46, her body bore the marks of countless missions, most visibly the 4-inch scar across her collarbone, a souvenir from Afghanistan that few knew the true story behind. These late-night moments of solitude were rare treasures for the commander. As one of the few women to earn the Navy SEAL Trident, Sarah had learned to cherish privacy while never fully lowering her guard. Even now, with water cascading over her athletic frame, her senses remained sharp, her mind alert, despite the illusion of calm. The subtle change in air pressure was her first warning. The steam shifted, disturbed by the opening door. Without turning, she registered the presence of multiple intruders, 3 distinct footfalls, male, moving with deliberate purpose. "Well, what do we have here?" The voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to intimidation. Sarah turned slightly, enough to confirm what her instincts already knew. 3 men had entered the shower facility, positioning themselves strategically to block each potential exit. Sergeant Robert Davis stood closest, his 6-foot frame leaning against the tiled wall with practiced nonchalance. Behind him, Corporal Mark Brown crossed his arms, a smirk playing across his face. The youngest, Private William Smith, hovered uncertainly by the door, his eyes darting between his companions and their target. "Isn't it past your bedtime, gentlemen?" Sarah's voice remained measured, betraying none of the calculations running through her mind. Robert stepped forward, water droplets beating on his boots. "Just thought we'd welcome the new female personnel properly," he said, exchanging glances with his companions. "Make sure everyone understands how things work around here." The 3 men fanned out in a practiced formation. The sergeant moved toward the main exit, while his companions blocked the side door and emergency exit. Their movements suggested this wasn't their first such encounter. They operated with the arrogance of men who believed themselves untouchable, protected by a system of silence and complicity. Their voices echoed off the walls as they closed in, unaware they had just made the gravest miscalculation of their military careers. They saw only a lone woman, vulnerable and exposed. What they failed to recognize was the legendary SEAL commander whose reputation had been forged in the world's most dangerous combat zones, and who was about to deliver a lesson they would never forget. "Hey, sweetheart, you lost?" Sergeant Robert Davis sneered, his words dripping with mockery as Corporal Mark Brown and Private William Smith smirked behind him. The steam from the shower partially obscured their faces, but their predatory stances were unmistakable. Sarah didn't flinch. She turned slowly, water cascading down her athletic frame, her eyes sharp and unblinking. The fluorescent lights revealed what these men clearly hadn't expected: a body hardened by decades of the most grueling military training on Earth. "This is the officers' section," Robert continued, emboldened by her silence. "Pretty little thing like you must have taken a wrong turn." His gaze traveled inappropriately down her body, lingering where it shouldn't. At 46, Commander Sarah Johnson's physique told stories these men couldn't begin to comprehend. A 4-inch scar ran across her collarbone, silent testimony from a mission in Afghanistan, where she'd pulled 3 wounded Marines to safety under heavy fire. Another mark on her shoulder came from a Black Sea operation that remained classified to this day. Mark stepped forward, twirling a towel like a weapon. "We could help you find your way," he offered with false courtesy, his tone suggesting something entirely different. William, the youngest of the three, hung back slightly. Though participating, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his features as he glanced toward the door, perhaps the only one sensing that something about this woman wasn't adding up. The men laughed as Sarah reached for her towel with deliberate calm. Years of covert operations had taught her to assess threats instantly. 3 assailants, confined space, multiple exits. The commander recognized their type immediately. Bullies who preyed on those they perceived as vulnerable. "You know," Robert said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Nobody comes down here this late. Just us now." He took another step forward, invading her space. Sarah wrapped the towel around herself, her movements economical and precise. Not a gesture wasted, not a hint of the fear they expected to see. Instead, her posture shifted subtly into a combat-ready stance that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone with proper training. The SEAL commander met their taunts with a single, commanding sentence that cut through the steam-filled air. "Step back, now." Her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to giving orders in life-or-death situations. It was the voice that had directed classified operations across 4 continents, the voice that had commanded elite teams through impossible missions. For a fraction of a second, confusion crossed Robert's face. This wasn't the reaction he'd anticipated. But rather than retreat, he doubled down, reaching toward her arm with a sneer that would soon vanish completely. Robert Davis stepped closer, his muscled frame casting a long shadow across the steam-filled shower. His hand reached for Sarah Johnson's arm with unearned confidence. "Come on now, don't be difficult," he growled. Sarah moved with lethal precision, honed through years of special operations. In one fluid motion, she captured his wrist, twisting it into a brutal joint lock that sent immediate pain signals shooting up his arm. Before he could process what was happening, her elbow drove into his chest with controlled force, sending him sprawling backward against the slick tile wall. "What the?" Robert gasped. The wind knocked from his lungs as he slid down to the wet floor, eyes wide with shock and humiliation. Mark Brown lunged forward, pulling a collapsible baton from his back pocket that extended with a metallic snap. "You'll regret that," he threatened, swinging the weapon in a wide arc towards Sarah's shoulder. The commander sidestepped with practiced ease, her bare feet finding perfect traction on the wet surface. She swept her leg in a low, powerful arc that connected with Mark's ankles, dropping him hard onto the unforgiving floor. The baton clattered away, spinning across the tile as the corporal groaned, clutching his lower back. William Smith, the youngest of the 3, remained frozen near the doorway. His face had drained of color as he watched his companions, men he'd thought invincible, dispatched with effortless skill by the naked woman they'd intended to intimidate. The private's hand trembled slightly as it hovered near his side, uncertain whether to reach for his own weapon or retreat. "Who the hell are you?" William whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and dawning realization that they had catastrophically misjudged the situation. Sarah stood tall, unflinching despite her vulnerability, water still cascading down her scarred body. The 4-inch mark across her collarbone seemed to stand out more prominently now, a badge of survival from battles far more dangerous than this pathetic ambush. The answer to William's question came not from Sarah's lips, but from the sudden slam of the shower room door being thrown open. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the tiled space, drawing all eyes toward the entrance. A silhouette appeared in the doorway, backlit by the harsh fluorescent lights of the corridor beyond. The commanding presence that filled the frame needed no introduction to anyone familiar with the chain of command at Norfolk Naval Base. The confrontation had just escalated to an entirely different level, and the 3 men's futures in the military hung by the thinnest of threads. The shower room fell silent as Captain James Johnson strode through the doorway, his commanding presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. Water still dripped from the tiles as the three men froze in place. The captain's silver hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights, each strand earned through decades of dedicated service to his country. "I believe you just assaulted Commander Sarah Johnson, United States Navy SEAL, Medal of Honor recipient," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority that needed no shouting to be effective. His gaze methodically swept over the three stunned men, taking in their disheveled appearances and the unmistakable scene before him. Robert's face drained of color as the implications sank in. Mark scrambled to his feet, suddenly aware of the gravity of their actions. William, the youngest of the three, took an instinctive step backward, his eyes wide with dawning horror. Sarah reached for a towel hanging nearby, wrapping it around herself with practiced efficiency. The scar on her collarbone was momentarily visible, a reminder of battlefield courage that stood in stark contrast to the cowardice she'd just confronted. Water beaded on her shoulders as she stood tall, unfazed by the situation. "Captain Johnson." She nodded professionally, her composure absolute despite the circumstances. "I had it under control." There was no hint of distress in her voice, only the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting on a minor inconvenience. "No doubt, Commander," the captain replied, his weathered features revealing a complex mixture of respect and concern. His eyes briefly met hers in silent communication, the kind shared between seasoned officers who understood the unspoken burdens of command. The three men remained rooted in place, their earlier bravado utterly shattered by the revelation of who they had attempted to intimidate. Robert rubbed his wrist where Sarah had applied the hold, while Mark's gaze darted between the two officers, calculating the severity of their predicament. "Sir," William finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper, "we didn't know." Silence. Captain Johnson cut him off with a single word. "Military police are already on their way." He didn't raise his voice, but the steel beneath his words was unmistakable. Sarah gathered her belongings with methodical precision, her movements economical and controlled. The Norfolk Naval Base had suddenly become very quiet around them, as if the very walls were holding their breath. "You'll need to file a report," the captain said quietly to Sarah, professional concern evident in his tone. She nodded once, her expression unreadable. "I'm aware of the protocol." Her eyes briefly met those of her would-be attackers, and in that moment, they finally understood the magnitude of their error. They hadn't just assaulted a woman, they had challenged a legend. The military police arrived within minutes, their faces grim as they documented the incident. Two officers escorted the three men away, their swagger now replaced with visible unease. Robert Davis glanced back, his face a mixture of anger and embarrassment as he was led down the corridor. "Ye didn't know she was an officer," Robert muttered defensively, loud enough for everyone to hear. Sarah Johnson secured her towel more firmly and fixed him with an icy stare. "Would it have mattered, or would you have picked someone you thought couldn't fight back?" Her words hung in the air, sharp and precise as a combat knife. The sergeant had no response. The silence that followed was damning, broken only by the squeak of military boots on wet tile as the three assailants were escorted away. Mark and William kept their eyes down, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. Captain James Johnson remained behind, his authoritative presence filling the space. He dismissed the remaining personnel with a curt nod, creating a moment of privacy in the aftermath of chaos. "You'll need to file a formal report," he said, his voice softer now that they were alone. "Already planning on it," Sarah replied, gathering her belongings. Water still dripped from her hair, but her composure remained unshaken. "This isn't my first rodeo with this kind of behavior." The captain's eyes drifted to the prominent scar that ran across her collarbone, a jagged 4-inch reminder of past violence. "Kandahar?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded once, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly. Few people knew the classified details behind that wound, a night operation gone sideways, 3 teammates lost, and a mission that had altered the course of military intelligence in the region. 8th year anniversary next month, she said, her voice matter-of-fact. The captain nodded with understanding that went beyond words. He'd been there too. Not on that specific mission, but in similar moments where life hung by threads thinner than tactical gear could protect. "I'll make sure this incident doesn't disappear into administrative purgatory," he promised, his silver hair catching the harsh fluorescent light. "Things like this have a way of getting buried." "I'm counting on it not being buried," the commander replied, a subtle edge to her voice. "In fact, I'm counting on it being very visible." Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that this incident might be connected to larger patterns, to systems that protected predators and punished those who spoke out. "Get some rest, Commander," Captain Johnson said finally. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Sarah nodded, knowing that tonight's confrontation was merely the opening move in a much more dangerous game. The morning light filtered through the windows of the Norfolk Naval Base as Commander Sarah Johnson fastened the last button on her meticulously pressed uniform. Every crease was razor-sharp, her appearance a testament to decades of discipline. She adjusted her seal trident, the gold emblem catching the light, a deliberate display of identity and authority after last night's confrontation. Sarah ran her fingers over her collarbone, feeling the familiar ridge of her scar beneath the fabric. The shower incident had already become the talk of the base. She could feel eyes following her as she walked the corridor, whispers trailing in her wake. Some gazes held newfound respect, others uncertainty, but none dared approach her directly. "Commander Johnson put 3 guys on the floor," she overheard a young ensign whisper to his colleague. "Heard they didn't know who she was until it was too late." Sarah maintained her composure, neither acknowledging the gossip nor correcting the embellishments that had inevitably crept into the retelling. The truth was damning enough without exaggeration. She checked her watch, 0650. The meeting was scheduled for 700 hours. The sound of measured footsteps drew her attention. Captain James Johnson approached, his silver hair neatly trimmed, his uniform equally impeccable. Despite the shared surname, they were unrelated by blood, but bound by mutual respect, forged through years of service. "You're 5 minutes early," Sarah observed, straightening to attention. The captain's weathered face softened momentarily. "Old habits die hard," he replied, a faint smile flickering across his features before disappearing. "Especially after 30 years of naval service." Something in his eyes suggested more than professional courtesy, a heaviness, a purpose. The veteran officer gestured toward the administrative wing, and they fell into step together, their cadence perfectly matched. "The incident report has been filed," he said quietly. "Those men will face disciplinary action, but there's more at stake here." Sarah nodded, sensing the gravity in his tone. "More than 3 idiots in a shower room." "Much more," the captain confirmed. "What happened last night?" "It might have been a test, or a message." They passed the communications center, where several officers quickly averted their gazes. The base felt different this morning, charged with an undercurrent of tension that Sarah couldn't quite place. "We've been monitoring patterns," James continued, his voice dropping further. "Complaints buried, careers destroyed, people who speak up facing consequences." As they approached Commander Marshall's office, Sarah understood that this meeting would change everything. The shower confrontation wasn't an isolated incident. It was the first visible thread of something much darker, woven through the fabric of the institution they had both sworn to serve. Commander Jeffrey Marshall's office resembled a military fortress, every item precisely positioned as if arranged by ruler. A thick manila folder sat dead center on his polished desk, the bold red "Secret" stamp demanding attention. Sarah Johnson stood at parade rest, her posture betraying nothing of the previous night's confrontation. "At ease, Commander," Jeffrey said, gesturing to a chair. His voice carried the weight of 25 years of service, each word measured and deliberate. Lieutenant Colonel Linda Parker occupied the corner seat, her Pentagon credentials displayed prominently. The liaison's calculating gaze swept over Sarah, assessing every detail from her perfectly pressed uniform to the subtle confidence in her stance. "I understand there was an incident last night," Linda remarked, her tone neutral yet somehow accusatory. Sarah nodded once. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Jeffrey exchanged a meaningful glance with the Pentagon representative before sliding the classified folder forward. "The timing is convenient. We were planning to brief you next week, but circumstances have accelerated our timeline." He opened the folder, revealing surveillance photos, personnel files, and incident reports. "Operation Clean House," he explained, his finger tapping a mission brief. "A covert investigation into systematic harassment, misconduct, and what we now believe is a criminal conspiracy operating within the Navy's highest echelons. Norfolk is ground zero," Linda added, leaning forward. "What happened to you wasn't random, Commander Johnson. Your reputation precedes you. Someone wanted to test your reactions, see how you'd respond." Sarah studied the documents, recognizing patterns in the reports: complaints buried, witnesses reassigned, evidence misplaced. The military precision of the cover-ups suggested organization and protection from above. "How deep does this go?" she asked. Jeffrey's expression hardened. "We've identified at least 37 cases of harassment that follow the same pattern. When victims report, they face retaliation. When they persist..." His voice trailed off. "They disappear," Linda finished. "Transfers, sudden resignations, even accidents." Sarah recognized several names in the files, promising officers whose careers had mysteriously derailed after filing complaints. The systematic nature of the suppression spoke of something far beyond typical bureaucratic negligence. "Norfolk has the highest rate of unreported incidents in the Navy," Jeffrey continued. "We believe it's the hub of operations for whatever group is orchestrating this." "And you want me to what? Be the bait?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer. Linda's lips curved into something not quite a smile. "You've already caught their attention, Commander. The question is, are you willing to use that to help us bring down the entire network?" Sarah thought of the three men from the shower, pawns in a much larger game. "When do we start?" The manila folder lay open between them, revealing a mission that made even Sarah's combat deployments seem straightforward. Commander Jeffrey Marshall slid several photographs across the desk. Women in uniform, their careers and lives shattered. "Your credentials make you the perfect operative for this," Marshall explained, his fingers tapping a personnel file with Sarah Johnson's name emblazoned across the top. "Your combat record is impeccable. You've survived situations that would break most operators." Lieutenant Colonel Linda Parker leaned forward, her tailored uniform crisp against the office chair. "Let's be clear, Commander Johnson. Your bait." The Pentagon liaison's words were clinical, devoid of apology. "We need someone they can't easily intimidate, but who will draw them out." Sarah's gaze remained steady. "Last night wasn't random, was it?" She traced the edge of a photograph showing the three men who had cornered her. "Someone sent Davis and his cronies to test me." "We believe so," Marshall confirmed. "They're foot soldiers in something much larger." The pattern emerged with disturbing clarity as they reviewed case after case. Women who filed complaints found their careers mysteriously derailed. Performance reviews suddenly contained fabricated infractions. Security clearances revoked for inconsistencies. And in the most troubling cases, accidents, training mishaps, equipment failures, even apparent suicides. "The system is designed to protect them," Parker said, spreading out a timeline of buried complaints. "We've documented 47 cases in the last 3 years at Norfolk alone." Captain James Johnson had remained silent until now, his weathered face a mask of controlled grief. "My daughter, Rebecca, was one of them." His voice barely wavered as he slid a photograph across the table, a young lieutenant with his eyes and determined jaw. "She filed a formal complaint about unauthorized access to secure systems. 3 weeks later, they found her in her quarters, gunshot wound. Ruled a suicide, Marshall added quietly. She wasn't suicidal, the captain insisted, his knuckles white against the edge of the desk. Rebecca was going to expose something bigger than harassment, something that frightened powerful people. Sarah studied the photograph, seeing the resemblance between father and daughter, the same determination, the same sense of duty. What was she investigating? That's what we need to find out, Marshall replied, and why we need someone they can't easily silence. The weight of the mission settled on Sarah's shoulders, heavier than any pack she'd carried through Afghan mountains. This wasn't just about justice anymore. Looking at Captain Johnson's face, she understood it was personal for him, and now it would be personal for her too. Captain James Johnson's eyes betrayed a grief that no official report could capture. The military had dismissed his daughter's death with clinical efficiency. Suicide, case closed in 48 hours. But Sarah Johnson knew better. She'd seen enough combat to recognize when evidence had been sanitized. Rebecca was a fighter, James said, his weathered face tightening as he pulled a worn photograph from his wallet. Top of her class at Annapolis. She was never one to give up, Commander, not on anything. Sarah studied the image, a young woman with her father's determined jawline, standing proudly in uniform. The resemblance between father and daughter was unmistakable, as was the strength in Rebecca's eyes. I believe you, Sarah replied, handing back the photograph, and I promise you, we'll find what she was looking for. The captain nodded, composing himself with military precision. Thank you, Sarah. Turned to Lieutenant Colonel Parker, who had been observing their exchange with calculated interest. I need complete access to personnel files going back 5 years, every complaint, every transfer, every resignation. Security footage from all sectors, especially areas with reported incidents. And I want to conduct private interviews without chain of command observation. Parker raised an eyebrow. That's an extensive request, Commander. This is an extensive problem, Sarah countered, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. After a moment, the Pentagon liaison nodded. I'll authorize it, but understand something. Parker leaned forward, lowering her voice. Not everyone wants this exposed. There are powerful people who benefit from the current system. Watch who you trust. Sarah held her gaze. Noted. The files will be available by 0800 tomorrow, Parker continued, rising from her chair. Use my clearance code for the restricted archives. I'll arrange a secure room for your interviews. As Parker left, Sarah turned back to Captain Johnson. The silver-haired officer seemed to have aged years in minutes. She was investigating something bigger than harassment, wasn't she? Sarah asked quietly. James nodded. Rebecca mentioned patterns in her last call, said she'd found connections that didn't make sense. 3 days later, she was gone. Sarah's mind raced, connecting invisible threads. Rebecca's death, the coordinated harassment, the systematic burial of complaints. This wasn't random cruelty. It was organized suppression. This isn't just about justice anymore, she said, her voice hardening. It's about survival. The captain met her eyes with grim understanding. They both knew the truth. Whoever had silenced Rebecca Johnson wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone else who came too close to their secret. Sarah Johnson moved through the Norfolk Naval Base with the careful precision that had defined her career. What should have been a state-of-the-art facility revealed troubling vulnerabilities, cameras with obvious blind spots, outdated security protocols, and locked doors that barely deserve the name. These surveillance feeds have been positioned to miss key areas, she noted, studying the monitor bank in the security office. Chief Warrant Officer Daniel nodded, uncomfortably, his fingers tapping against his desk. Budget constraints, he offered weakly, though his eyes told a different story. As head of information systems, Daniel controlled access to all surveillance footage, a position that made him either a valuable ally or a dangerous obstacle. I'll need complete access to the archives, Sarah said, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request. The chief hesitated. That requires authorization from... It's already approved, she interrupted. sliding over the paperwork bearing Captain Johnson's signature. Daniel's expression tightened, but he complied. Later that afternoon, Sarah met with Petty Officer Emily Miller in the relative privacy of an empty conference room. The young woman sat ramrod straight, her eyes constantly darting toward the door. "I filed my complaint 9 months ago," Emily explained, voice barely above a whisper. 3 other women filed similar reports about Lieutenant Commander Brown. 2 transferred out immediately. 1 left the service entirely. "And you stayed," Sarah observed. "Someone had to," the petty officer replied, a flicker of determination breaking through her fear. As if summoned by their conversation, Michael Brown appeared in the hallway outside, pausing deliberately to stare through the glass partition. His smug smile never wavered as he made a point of checking his watch, a silent reminder of his continued authority. "He does that every day," Emily said. "Make sure I see him. Reminds me he's still here, still in charge." While my career has stalled, Sarah watched the lieutenant commander saunter away. "Has he approached you directly since the complaint?" "No need. His friends do it for him." Emily's hands trembled slightly. "Last week, my personal files were accessed without authorization. My medical records, my performance reviews, all of it." The commander made notes, connecting patterns. "Who handled your complaint initially?" "Lieutenant Colonel Parker from the Pentagon Liaison Office. She seemed supportive at first, but then—" Emily trailed off. "Then what?" "The investigation just disappeared. When I followed up, I was told to focus on my duties and stop creating problems." Sarah nodded, pieces falling into place. The same name, Parker, had appeared in connection with Rebecca Johnson's case. "I need to know everything," she said quietly. "Every incident, every witness, every detail you can remember." As Emily began to speak, Sarah glanced toward the camera in the corner of the room. Its red light blinked steadily, recording their conversation for anyone with access to watch. In this base full of eyes and ears, she wondered who else was listening, and how much time they had left before the conspiracy closed ranks against them. Sarah Johnson sat across from Dr. Lisa Thompson in the small medical office tucked away in the east wing of Norfolk Naval Base. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the doctor's face as she slid a folder across the desk. "I've been tracking these inconsistencies for months," Lisa explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Medical records accessed without authorization, files altered after I've signed off on them. Documentation that simply disappears." Sarah leafed through the pages, her trained eyes quickly spotting the pattern. "How many cases are we talking about?" 27 that I've confirmed," the medical officer replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Always women who filed complaints. Their psychological evaluations get flagged. Medications suddenly appear in their history that I never prescribed." The commander nodded grimly. "And when you've reported these discrepancies, it always calls them system glitches," Lisa said with bitter emphasis. "Chief Warrant Officer Daniel personally assured me they were working on it. That was 8 months ago." Sarah pulled Rebecca Johnson's file from the stack. Captain Johnson's daughter's medical records showed the same tampering, psychological notes added posthumously suggesting a history of depression that contradicted the doctor's original assessment. "Rebecca never showed signs of suicidal ideation," Dr. Thompson insisted, leaning forward. "I evaluated her 3 days before her death. She was angry, determined, not depressed." The pattern was unmistakable. Women who reported harassment had their credibility systematically undermined through altered medical histories. If they persisted, accidents happened. "There's more," Lisa continued, lowering her voice further. "Lieutenant Jessica Smith came to me last month, asking about similar patterns. She mentioned nuclear command protocols, said she'd found something in the security logs." Sarah's pulse quickened. Did she elaborate? No, but she seemed frightened. Not just concerned, truly scared. The doctor hesitated. 2 days later, her medical file was accessed at 3 in the morning. "I only know because I've set up my own monitoring system." Sarah studied the access logs. The user credentials, belonged to Admiral Charles Wallace, a man who, according to base records, had been at a Pentagon briefing at that exact time. Every time I've tried to report these breaches through official channels, the complaints vanish, Lisa admitted. It's like shouting into a void. Standing to leave, Sarah placed a hand on the doctor's shoulder. Not anymore. Keep documenting everything, but be careful who sees you doing it. As she walked through the corridors of the base, Sarah felt the weight of what she'd discovered. The conspiracy wasn't just about harassment. It was a sophisticated operation with access to secure systems at the highest levels. Fear and complicity had allowed it to flourish, but now she was determined to break it open, whatever the cost. Commander Sarah Johnson stood at the entrance of the communications center, her posture rigid and her gaze fixed on Lieutenant Commander Michael Brown. The bustling room quieted as personnel sensed the tension crackling between them. Sarah had deliberately chosen this public setting. Witnesses were essential when confronting someone protected by a system of silence. Lieutenant Commander Brown, I'd like to discuss the complaints filed against you over the past 18 months, she said, her voice carrying across the room. Several technicians paused their work, eyes widening. Brown's face hardened as he approached. Commander, this is hardly the appropriate venue for personnel matters, he replied, voice low but strained. Perhaps we should discuss this in private. Like you discussed matters privately with Petty Officer Miller? Sarah countered, maintaining steady eye contact. Or the 6 other women who filed complaints that mysteriously disappeared from their records. The officer's composure slipped momentarily before he recovered, straightening his uniform. You're overstepping, Commander. My record speaks for itself. 20 years of service without a blemish. A clean record doesn't mean clean conduct, Sarah responded. It might just mean efficient cover-ups. Brown leaned closer, his voice barely audible. You should be careful who you challenge. Rank has privileges, and some of us have powerful friends. Before Sarah could respond, her secure device vibrated. A message from Captain James Johnson, encrypted with their shared protocol. Urgent. Lieutenant Smith missing 36 hours. Last seen accessing nuclear command security files. Meet 1400 hours usual location. Sarah felt a chill run through her body. Jessica Smith, bright, determined, and now gone. Just like Rebecca Johnson before her. The young lieutenant had been tracing the same security breaches, following the same dangerous trail. We'll continue this discussion later, Lieutenant Commander, she said, stepping back from Brown, whose smug expression only confirmed her suspicions. As Sarah exited the communications center, she noticed Chief Warrant Officer Daniel watching from the station, his expression unreadable. Had he been monitoring her movements? The web of surveillance and counter-surveillance was tightening around her. She made her way through the base using an indirect route, checking repeatedly for tails. The pattern was unmistakable now. Anyone who dug too deep into the security protocols disappeared or was silenced. First Rebecca, now Jessica. Sarah checked her watch, 90 minutes until her meeting with the captain. The stakes were escalating rapidly. Whatever conspiracy they were unraveling, it clearly extended beyond harassment into something far more dangerous. And someone was willing to make people disappear to protect it. Sarah Johnson sat in a dimly lit office, surrounded by stacks of personnel files. The pattern was unmistakable. Every woman who had filed a harassment complaint over the past 3 years had either been transferred, resigned, or disappeared entirely from service records. The commander ran her hand through her short hair, fatigue setting in after 14 hours of continuous investigation. It's systematic, she told Captain James as he entered with 2 cups of coffee. They're not just silencing complaints, they're erasing the complainants. The captain nodded grimly, sliding 1 cup toward her. Rebecca noticed the same thing. His voice caught slightly at his daughter's name. She documented everything meticulously, as she always did. Sarah opened a secure laptop, displaying a spreadsheet Lieutenant Jessica Smith had compiled before her disappearance. Jessica wasn't just looking into harassment cases, she found something much bigger. She pointed to a column of timestamps, These are unauthorized access points to nuclear command protocols, all using Admiral-level credentials. James leaned closer, his expression darkening. But the admirals in question were all accounted for elsewhere during these breaches. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. Someone's using stolen or duplicated credentials, and anyone who notices. She didn't need to finish the thought. The captain pulled out a worn leather notebook, Rebecca's journal. My daughter discovered the same pattern 3 months before her death. She traced 6 separate security breaches to Admiral Wallace's credentials while he was demonstrably overseas. Sarah's eyes widened. Charles Wallace? The 3-star? The very same, James confirmed. Rebecca brought her concerns to Linda Parker at the Pentagon. And 48 hours later, she was dead, Sarah concluded, the pieces falling into place. They spread the evidence across the desk, service records, security logs, and medical reports Dr. Lisa Thompson had secretly preserved despite orders to purge them. The pattern was undeniable, a shadow network operating within the highest echelons of naval command. The harassment ring is just a cover, Sarah realized. They're using it to identify potential whistleblowers, then systematically removing anyone who might notice the security breaches. Captain Johnson's face was ashen. This goes beyond misconduct. Someone's creating backdoor access to our nuclear command structure. Sarah closed the file containing Jessica's notes. And now Jessica's gone too, just like the others. The captain stood, his military bearing returning. We need to move quickly. If they realize what we know, they'll come for us next, Sarah finished. She gathered the evidence, securing it in a waterproof pouch. We need to find Jessica before she becomes another statistic. James nodded, his eyes reflecting both determination and fear. Be careful, Commander. We're not just dealing with harassers anymore. These people have admiral-level access and are willing to kill to protect their operation. Sarah checked her service weapon. Then we'd better be ready for them. The abandoned boathouse at the edge of the naval base provided perfect cover. Sarah Johnson arrived first, checking for surveillance before slipping inside. The wooden structure creaked with each step, but she trusted the location. It was off most security grids, a blind spot she'd discovered during her initial assessment. Captain James Johnson arrived 17 minutes later, his silver hair barely visible in the dim light filtering through salt-crusted windows. They exchanged no greetings, falling immediately into the practiced movements of those who'd operated in hostile territory. We're compromised deeper than I thought, the captain said, producing a weathered leather case. From it, he extracted a specialized encrypted device, one not connected to any network. Old school, he explained, like what we used in Sevastopol. Sarah nodded, memories of the Black Sea operation washing over her. That mission had cost them 3 good operators and left her with the scar across her collarbone. Some wounds never fully heal, she murmured, touching the mark unconsciously. The device illuminated, casting blue light across their faces as James accessed the files. 5 years of systematic breaches, he explained, pointing to timestamp patterns. Always using admiral-level credentials, but often when those officers were demonstrably elsewhere. Spoofed authentication, Sarah concluded, studying the data. But this level of access requires physical proximity to secure terminals. Exactly. The captain's voice tightened. Rebecca discovered the same pattern before she died. These aren't random breaches. They're coordinated, methodical. Someone's creating backdoor access to our nuclear command structure. Sarah scrolled through the logs, recognizing a disturbing pattern. The credentials most frequently used belonged to Admiral Wallace, the same Wallace who blocked 3 separate investigations into harassment complaints, James added, including the one Rebecca filed 2 weeks before her death. The wind howled outside, rattling the weathered boards. Both officers instinctively lowered their voices, old habits from missions where walls had ears. We're dealing with something bigger than a harassment ring, Sarah said, connecting the pieces. The sexual misconduct cases, they're the smokescreen. The real operation is about control of our nuclear protocols. James nodded grimly, and anyone who gets close to discovering it ends up silenced. Rebecca, potentially Lieutenant Smith, and others we may not even know about. Sarah closed the device, her mind racing through contingencies. Our enemy isn't foreign. It's here, walking the same halls, attending the same briefings. Shielded by rank, reputation, and the very system designed to protect us, the captain concluded. They departed separately, carrying pieces of evidence that could bring down the highest levels of naval command, or get them both killed. The conspiracy had tentacles reaching far beyond Norfolk, and Sarah knew their next move would determine whether they exposed the truth or joined the list of those who had disappeared trying. Sarah Johnson hunched over the glowing computer screen in a secluded corner of the archives, her fingers flying across the keyboard as classified documents revealed a pattern far more sinister than she'd initially suspected. What had begun as an investigation into sexual harassment had unraveled into something that threatened national security itself. "This isn't just about power over women," she whispered to Captain James Johnson as he leaned over her shoulder. "It's about power over everything." The evidence was damning. The harassment network served as perfect cover, creating an atmosphere of fear and silence that allowed the conspirators to operate undetected. Behind this smokescreen, a select group was systematically positioning themselves to seize control of nuclear launch protocols. "They've been planting loyalists at every verification checkpoint," Sarah explained, pointing to personnel transfers that couldn't be coincidental. In a crisis scenario, they could override civilian authority completely. James rubbed his silver hair, his face ashen. Rebecca must have stumbled onto this. That's why they silenced her. The captain's voice cracked slightly at the mention of his daughter. Sarah placed a hand briefly on his shoulder before returning to the evidence. Dr. Lisa Thompson joined them, carrying medical files that had been deliberately misfiled. These psychological evaluations were altered. Officers who questioned certain protocols were flagged as unstable and removed. The conspiracy led straight to Admiral Charles Wallace, whose name appeared in connection with every suspicious transfer and security breach. His technical expert, known only as Professor, had designed backdoor access to systems that should have been impenetrable. Wallace has 3 admirals and at least 12 senior officers in his pocket, Sarah said, organizing the evidence into encrypted files. And Lieutenant Colonel Parker is feeding him information directly from the Pentagon. Every document they uncovered tightened the noose around their own necks. Sarah knew they were being watched. Security cameras had pivoted toward her twice that day, and Chief Warrant Officer Daniel had questioned her presence in restricted areas. "We need irrefutable proof," James insisted. "Something they can't bury or explain away." Sarah closed the files and faced him squarely. "I'm going to give them the target they can't resist, me." The plan was dangerous but necessary. Sarah would deliberately access certain files, triggering alerts that would force the conspirators to act. Meanwhile, James would secure their evidence with Admiral Hollister, the only flag officer they believed remained untainted. "They'll come for you," James warned. Sarah checked her sidearm, her expression resolute. "I'm counting on it. Sometimes the only way to catch predators is to become prey." As she left the archives, Sarah felt eyes following her. The game had changed. This was no longer about justice for harassment victims. It was about preventing a shadow government from seizing America's nuclear arsenal. The disappearances happened with alarming precision. Lieutenant Jessica Smith vanished first, her quarters found empty, with her encrypted device still charging on the nightstand. 12 hours later, Petty Officer Emily Miller failed to report for duty. Her apartment showed signs of a struggle. A toppled lamp, a single shoe beneath the coffee table. Sarah Johnson assembled the evidence on a secure terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she connected the dots. Both women had accessed the same server logs before vanishing. Both had uncovered irregular patterns in the nuclear command authentication protocols. "They're being held at Meridian Defense Solutions," Sarah told Captain James Johnson during their clandestine meeting in the base chapel. The captain's face hardened as she showed him satellite imagery of the contractor facility 10 miles outside Norfolk. "Wallace's fingerprints are all over this," James said, studying the compound's layout. "He sits on their board of directors." Admiral Charles Wallace had cultivated an impeccable reputation. Decorated combat veteran, strategic genius, philanthropist. But Sarah had found the thread that unraveled his carefully constructed image. Shell companies, offshore accounts, and a pattern of accidents befalling those who questioned his authority. "I need access to the Level 4 protocols," Sarah explained. "There's a back door in the system, if I can trace it while it's active." "Too dangerous," the captain interrupted. "Wallace has eyes everywhere." Sarah's jaw tightened. Emily and Jessica risked everything. "I won't abandon them." That night, she used her commander credentials to enter the secure communications hub. The night shift operator barely glanced up as she began the trace program Dr. Thompson had secretly provided. Sarah had just located the source signature when klaxons blared throughout the facility. "Security breach in Sector 7. The automated announcement echoed through corridors as red lights flashed. Sarah quickly transferred the data to a microchip and slipped it into her boot as armed guards burst through the door. "Commander Johnson, you're accessing restricted systems without authorization," the lead guard announced, weapon drawn. "I have clearance," she replied calmly, though she knew the trap had been set long before she arrived. Across the base, Captain Johnson received Sarah's predetermined signal, a seemingly innocent text about a postponed training exercise. He immediately gathered their accumulated evidence and disappeared into the night, activating the contingency plan they had established. As military police escorted Sarah to a holding cell, she caught sight of Admiral Wallace watching from the second-floor gallery, his expression unreadable. Their eyes locked briefly, a silent acknowledgement that the real battle had only just begun. Behind the steel door of her cell, Sarah smiled. They had taken her exactly where she needed to be. Sarah sat in the detention room, her posture rigid, despite the uncomfortable metal chair. The military police had made a show of escorting her across the base, ensuring everyone witnessed the decorated SEAL commander's apparent fall from grace. The concrete walls seemed to close in as hours passed, but Sarah remained calm, knowing this was part of a larger strategy. The door swung open without warning. Admiral Richard Hollister entered, his weathered face betraying nothing as he dismissed the guards with a curt nod. Once alone, the senior officer's demeanor shifted subtly. "Commander Johnson, I apologize for the theatrics," he said, his voice low. "But we needed Wallace to believe he'd won this round." Sarah leaned forward. "Sir, Lieutenant Smith and Petty Officer Miller are still missing." Hollister activated a small device that emitted a soft hum, a signal jammer. "That's why I'm here. This conspiracy goes deeper than we initially thought." He spread several photographs across the table, revealing surveillance images of high-ranking officers meeting at locations outside normal channels. At the center of every gathering, Admiral Charles Wallace. "We've identified 7 flag officers compromised by Wallace," Hollister explained. "They've been systematically accessing nuclear command protocols, creating backdoor authentication that would bypass civilian oversight during a crisis." Sarah studied the images. "And Lieutenant Colonel Parker? Deep in Wallace's pocket, she's been feeding him information about your investigation while pretending to support it." The revelation stung, but Sarah had suspected Parker's duplicity when certain leads mysteriously went cold. "There's someone else," Hollister continued, sliding forward a blurry photograph. "They call him the Professor, a technical genius who's designed the override systems. We believe he's holding Smith and Miller at the contractor facility." Sarah's detention suddenly made perfect sense. "You're using me as a distraction." Hollister nodded. While Wallace and his people are focused on containing you, SEAL Team 4 is preparing to raid the facility tonight. I should be leading that team, Sarah insisted. You will be, Hollister replied with the ghost of a smile. Your escape is scheduled for 2100 hours. Captain Johnson will rendezvous with you at the extraction point with the necessary equipment. Sarah felt a surge of determination. James would ensure everything was prepared. His daughter's memory demanded nothing less. One more thing, Commander, Hollister added gravely. If Wallace realizes what we're doing, he'll accelerate his timeline. We have intelligence suggesting he's prepared to trigger a false nuclear alert to force implementation of his shadow protocols. Sarah stood, resolution hardening her features. Not on my watch, sir. The Admiral extended his hand. Good hunting, Commander. The future of command integrity is in your hands. Under the cover of darkness, the extraction team moved like ghosts across the contractor facility's perimeter. Commander Sarah Johnson led from the front, her years of SEAL training evident in every calculated movement. The team communicated through hand signals, their night vision equipment revealing the compound's layout in eerie green hues. Alpha Team, secure the east entrance, Sarah whispered into her communication device. Bravo, with me. The breach was textbook perfection, silent, swift, and overwhelming. Guards fell before they could raise alarms, subdued with practiced efficiency. But as the team swept through the facility's detention area, Sarah's heart sank. The cells were empty, showing signs of recent occupation. They moved them, Captain James Johnson's voice crackled through her earpiece. Satellite imagery shows increased activity at Wallace's private island in the Bahamas. They're consolidating. A lone figure remained, handcuffed to a desk in the communications hub. Professor Howard Chen, the technical mastermind behind the conspiracy's infrastructure. The man looked disheveled, his usually immaculate appearance now marred by fear and exhaustion. They left me, Chen stammered as Sarah approached. I'm expendable now that the system is operational. Sarah's interrogation was brief but effective. What's Wallace planning? Where are Lieutenant Smith and Petty Officer Miller? Chen's revelation sent ice through her veins. Admiral Charles Wallace had designed a failsafe within the nuclear command structure, a system-wide reset that would temporarily lock out all authentication protocols across the fleet. In the ensuing chaos, only Wallace's shadow system would remain operational, forcing military leadership to rely on his infrastructure during what would appear to be a catastrophic system failure. It's brilliant, really, Chen explained with inappropriate admiration. The military will have no choice but to accept his oversight to maintain nuclear readiness. By the time they realize it's permanent, it'll be too late. The captives, including Jessica Smith and Emily Miller, had been transported to Wallace's island compound as insurance. The Admiral had accelerated his timeline after Sarah's investigation gained traction. The reset sequence initiates in 24 hours, Chen added. Once it begins, there's no stopping it without my countermeasure codes. Sarah exchanged a knowing glance with her team. Then you're coming with us, Professor. As they secured Chen for transport, Sarah contacted Admiral Hollister directly. Sir, we have confirmation of Wallace's plan and a potential countermeasure. Request immediate authorization for extraction operation on Bahamian territory. The response was immediate. Authorization granted, Commander. Get our people back and stop that reset, whatever it takes. Sarah's mind raced with tactical calculations as the helicopter lifted off. The clock was ticking, and somewhere on that island, Wallace was preparing to seize control of America's most devastating weapons. Sarah Johnson's team moved with surgical precision through the dimly lit communications hub. The facility's sophisticated security systems had been no match for their specialized training. Within moments, they had secured the main control room, disabling the primary transmission arrays that Wallace had planned to use for his takeover. Hub neutralized, Sarah whispered into her secure comm device. Her face, illuminated by the blue glow of computer screens, showed fierce determination as she personally secured Professor Howard Chen. The technical mastermind offered surprisingly little resistance, his eyes wide with fear as she zip-tied his hands. "You don't understand what you've done," Chen muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. "I understand perfectly," the commander replied, her voice steady. "Now give me the counter-sequence." Outside, 20 miles off the Norfolk coast, a Black Hawk helicopter descended toward a sleek vessel cutting through dark waters. Admiral Charles Wallace stood on the deck, his distinguished uniform at odds with his current status as a fugitive. The helicopter's spotlight caught him in its harsh glare as Navy SEALs rappelled down with practiced efficiency. "It's over, Admiral," the team leader announced through a loudspeaker. Wallace's face contorted with rage. "Lieutenant Colonel Parker, now!" he barked into his communication device. Back at the Pentagon, Parker's fingers flew across her keyboard, initiating Protocol Omega, the final failsafe in their conspiracy. Alarms blared across 5 different naval command centers as authentication protocols began systematically locking down. "We've got a problem," James Johnson's voice crackled through Sarah's earpiece. "They've triggered something big. Nuclear command protocols are being overridden." Sarah pressed her sidearm against Chen's temple. "The counter-sequence, now." The professor recited a complex string of alphanumeric characters, which Sarah relayed immediately to Captain Johnson. For 30 agonizing seconds, the fate of American nuclear security hung in the balance. "It's working," James finally confirmed, relief evident in his voice. Hollister's team is regaining control. On the vessel, Wallace and 2 loyal officers were secured in restraints. The Admiral's face, once commanding respect throughout the Navy, now showed only defeat. "You have no idea what forces you're playing with," he spat as they led him away. Meanwhile, Parker was apprehended at her Pentagon office, her expression one of cold fury as military police escorted her from the building. Sarah stood in the communications hub, watching as technicians secured the facility. The counter-sequence had worked with only seconds to spare, preventing a catastrophic override of America's nuclear command structure. "Commander," one of her team members called, "Admiral Hollister is requesting immediate secure communication." Sarah nodded, exhaustion briefly visible on her face before her professional mask returned. The conspiracy had been stopped, but the work of rebuilding trust in the Navy's command structure was just beginning. 2 days later, Sarah Johnson stood at attention in Admiral Richard Hollister's spacious office, sunlight streaming through the windows of Norfolk Naval Base. The weight of the past weeks showed in the slight shadows beneath her eyes, but her posture remained impeccable, her Navy uniform pristine. "At ease, Commander," Hollister said, his weathered face showing the first genuine smile in months. "What you've accomplished can't be overstated." The evidence against the conspiracy had proven overwhelming. 7 flag officers, Lieutenant Colonel Parker, Professor Chen, and 12 others were in custody, facing charges ranging from treason to conspiracy. The web of corruption had been extensive, reaching into corners of military leadership few had suspected. "We've recovered both Lieutenant Smith and Petty Officer Miller," the Admiral continued, sliding a folder across his desk. "They're shaken, but alive. Their testimony will be crucial." Sarah nodded, thinking of the women whose courage had helped break the case. "And Captain Johnson? James has been officially recognized for his persistence in the face of institutional resistance," Hollister replied. "The investigation into his daughter's death has been reopened with my personal oversight. Rebecca will finally receive the justice she deserves." The captain had already begun working with a specialized team to rebuild the Navy's command culture from the ground up. His silver hair seemed less burdened now, his purpose renewed by vindication. "Admiral Wallace?" Sarah asked, singing like a canary to save himself from a lifetime at Leavenworth, Hollister said with satisfaction. "Chen too. Between them, we're closing security gaps I didn't even know existed." Sarah gazed out the window at the harbor, where warships gleamed in the morning light. The weapons they carried, the most destructive force humanity had ever created, had nearly fallen under shadow control. The thought still chilled her. "Your next assignment," Hollister said, tapping another folder. "Strategic Command Systems Integrity. You'll oversee the complete overhaul of our authentication protocols. I need someone who understands both the technical and human vulnerabilities." Sarah accepted the folder, understanding the responsibility it represented. "Thank you, sir." "No, Commander, thank you." Hollister stood, extending his hand. "For Rebecca, for Jessica and Emily, and for every voice that was silenced." As Sarah left the office, she passed a wall of photographs, generations of Navy personnel who had served with honor. Soon, Rebecca Johnson's picture would join them. Her sacrifice finally acknowledged, the weapons of war would remain where they belonged, under the control of the people, not the shadows. Sarah straightened her shoulders and walked toward her new mission, carrying the memory of those who had fought alongside her, both the living and the dead.